an elephant and piggy book, and it was like, there's a bird on my head. Okay, let's all pretend that there's a bird on our head. What would we do? If you're just pausing like that for a moment throughout the story, they're going to remember the order of things. It's going to help them remember the setting, the character names. Let's talk engagement. Engagement is probably one of my favorite things. However, as a new teacher, I thought that all my class sessions, everything that I was teaching, had to be a huge production, very dramatic, lots of decorations. And during my credential program, one of my professors had shared about anticipatory sets. If you don't know what that means, it's kind of the hook of the lesson. How do you get the students interested, the buy-in? Well, this professor had also shared a video of a teacher, and she had kind of come dressed in. She had a little chef's toque on, and the blackboard behind her kind of had pizza toppings and like a restaurant menu. On the tables, each student had, there was kind of 4 desks together. And in the center, there was like a felt pizza, different cutouts for each student, slices, and some toppings. And they had to kind of decorate their pizza slice. So if you're tracking with me, you might start to see that the teacher was going to be prepping them on fractions. How many students put pepperoni? How many had vegetables on theirs? And this hook made me so excited to become a teacher. And this is why I thought that all of my lessons had to be this big production. That I had to have all these engaging ideas and costumes and all of those things. Surprise! They didn't. I didn't have that. At the beginning, as a new teacher, I was so overwhelmed with just planning a lesson and getting through the day that I was discouraged to create these big anticipatory sets. I didn't have all of these tools to help my students be engaged when I first entered into the classroom. And because I didn't have these costumes, I was really discouraged. I really didn't know how to engage students quickly. And so I want to share with you, what does engagement actually mean, and what are some ways to implement this that won't break your budget? Because engagement doesn't have to be a dramatic, big production. Engagement just means students are learning and participating. And if they're doing that, they are engaging. They're engaging with what you're teaching. And engagement is so important, because if students aren't engaged in what you are teaching, if they're not interested, if there's no buy-in, they're not going to learn. They're going to sit there, they may absorb it for a bit, but it's not going to be retained. And this is kind of the other reason why I thought everything had to be a big production, because when I think back on my experiences, it was those big projects, those immersive experiences that I had that I still remembered, because it was tied to, something unique, something special, interesting, and different. So I want to share with you some ways that you can add in some engagement that won't cost you too much, they won't be too elaborate, and they can be things that you can recycle and reuse throughout the year. One key component with lesson planning is pacing. This was something, it took me a while to learn this, but when I was building my lessons, I kind of focused on me. All of the things that I needed to say, things that I needed to do, the objectives, the standards. But something I didn't build in was, what should the students be saying? What should the students be doing? How am I going to check for understanding? And I had to learn how to build this into my lessons. And so when you're starting to set up your lesson planning, or what you're going to be doing each day on the different standards or concepts or subjects, stop and reflect and think about where students might need to spend more time discussing, where they might need a little bit of interest to drive where the lesson is going. So discussions, reflections, and call and response are great strategies to implement. These are quick, easy. Call and response are so fun because they can be chants. You can turn them into kind of sing-song or have the students move around with them. But if there's something that you want them to focus on, if it's a sound of the day, if it's sight words, those kinds of things, you say it, they repeat it. And there's tons of things out there that you can look at. Reflections are also really great ways to kind of gauge energy. If the energy is too high, or if you want students to kind of settle down, if it's after recess, you kind of come in, reset the tone, have them reflect on maybe a question, something interesting. These reflections can be great ways for students to kind of think about it and put purpose to what you're going to be learning about before you start discussing. We want that connection to be there so it stays long term. And also along with reflections are pair and share. Sharing with a partner, with a group of students, turning to their neighbor to talk. These are really great too because they allow students to be social. It also gives them an opportunity to hear what somebody else might think if they're not ready to understand or they don't have anything to comment, they can kind of have a discussion. And finding a partner. There's so many of those fun ones if you hand them out and it's like, let's say I got peanut butter and someone has jelly and they have to go find them, ketchup and mustard. However you do it, I used to have like clock time. So I'd say, hey, go get your 30-minute partner, and then they'd find on their clock which partner that was, and that just kept the rotation of partners. But these are great too because it gets them up, moving, finding someone, they come back, and maybe you have them share out what they learned. Movement is also a great way. Sometimes during read alouds is my favorite place to implement movement because if you're going to ask students questions about the book, it's good to incorporate where you want to maybe pause, have them do something so they're remembering the elements of the story. So recently I was reading an Elephant and Piggy book, and it was like, there's a bird on my head. Okay, let's all pretend that there's a bird on our head. What would we do? If you're just pausing like that for a moment throughout the story, they're going to remember the order of things. It's going to help them remember the setting, the character names. Also too, if you're going to do a read aloud, like I shared, and ask questions after, you want to set the tone. Hey, we're going to read a story today, and I want you to look for what kind of character qualities do these characters have. Because when we let the students know what we're going to be asking them, what the purpose behind the read aloud is, they're going to be more likely to tune in. Okay, I got to listen because I have to share out. Another example of activity you could do or a movement is, I was reading Mercy Watson to some students and they say, a toast to mercy, a toast to mercy. And so I said, all right, everyone, let's grab our orange juice and let's all toast to mercy, right? And we're just pretending. But that element of pretending and adding in a little bit different than just reading the story through, it gives them it's engagement, right? It's engaging. You're doing something with them. You're adding to it. At the end of, if you give a mouse a cookie, okay, let's all eat some of these yummy cookies. Let's gobble them all. They love doing that. They love pretend. And of course, I'm speaking to elementary students, but you can do this with middle school and high school. It's just finding what's appropriate with them and knowing your class, what kind of things they enjoy. A lot of times it's songs, or it's adding in, fun elements to that too, but just any kind of movement will help, especially when you're developing vocabulary. But this engagement component, as I shared, it's essential. It's so important, and it gets skipped over because, like I said, when we're planning our lessons, we're looking to, what do I have to do? What do I have to share? what's going to be on the test, what needs to be covered. And we need to kind of reflect after that and then see, okay, where do I need to adjust so that my students can participate, they can engage, they can reflect, inquire. Those things you want to be able to add those in, because students they're not able to sit for that long of time and retain everything. They need to have opportunities to connect with what you're saying, to make meaning, and why should I remember this? They need to have that answered for them when you're doing any kinds of assessments. So make sure, if you enjoy this content, I'm going to continue talking about how important engagement is. Click like, subscribe to follow along with more tips and tricks on how you can be successful engaging your students, and share this with somebody else that's maybe in your credential program or another teacher friend. I hope to continue.